Hello and welcome to African Voices. It's Dr. Sibanda again with Baillor and Tchiyiwe Chihana, still talking about women in Africa and the International Women's Month. Just before the break, I was asking the question regarding your views on how you would discuss or think about the idea that the impression you get from the outside world is that the African society and its official dom is designed and still actively promotes the boy child over the girl child.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's exclusively an outside perception. I do think that it's real. It's a fact on the ground. Mm-hmm. As far as I think what you said before the break was also about the curriculum, things that we learn in schools, and they have been documented history and lessons have historically been documented by men. So and that terrain has been led by men predominantly. So the sort of language that is used, the expectations that are promoted, as well as the history that you see in African history books, is all about men as champions and women as the ones who took a back seat, which is actually not a fact. So you grow up with that. That's the education system that you're raised on, and that's what you think of the world. And so the importance of documenting African history, again, from the women's perspective, I think comes into play in this situation, is let's write women's stories. Let women also author their own narratives. You know, you hear about Asseya Santwa, you hear about Nzenga. You know, you hear of those iconic women who were either priestesses or queens. And then after that, everything else you read is, oh, my Afro hair. Yes, it's nice. We're talking more about Afro hair these days, but there's more to it than just that. When you're talking about the African woman, let's talk about the African women achievers. They might not be in the social realm. They're not supposed to be entertainers. They're supposed to be achievers of other things. We've got the Winnie Byanyimas of this world. If I asked a child today if they knew who Winnie Byanyima is, they won't know who that is. But she is the global executive director of Oxfam International. We've had Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who was recently the African Union chairperson. Mm-hmm. It's narratives like that. We have to start writing those narratives, even with men as partners. But I think if we lead from the helm as women, we'll take more of a standpoint on that. A lot of women authors like Chimamanda Adichie have done exceptionally well, although she did also start off in the realm of writing fiction stories, but she has gone more to writing biographies and things like that. We need more of that. We just need more beacons, I think, to be highlighted.
Mentioning Dlamini Zuma there, Dr. Dlamini Zuma from South Africa, you know, who recently as well wanted to be a president of the country. But looking at what you've just mentioned, those names that you've just called, in the other way around as well, in my opinion, I believe as well there are lots of women out there who are achievers, but sometimes they just don't take that initiative to put themselves out there or to publish their stories. Because if you look at most of these women that you've just mentioned as well, mm-hmm. if you look at their publishers or the people who write their stories are men, or men are behind it. Men are pushing them. So I believe the African women as well, my opinion, to be honest, need what you've just said to take that step. Not only to be, they are good mothers, because we've seen whatever they are wanting to do, they are able to achieve it, especially with the multitasking. But I believe the other thing as well that is affecting African women is the motherhood. Whereas if we look in the West here, women do choose their careers sometimes over having family life. Whereas in Africa, sometimes we take family to be more important. We take family to be the most thing at top. Like for instance, every woman's dream in Africa, we think the biggest thing is to get married, you know. Probably in West Africa, where I come from, I don't know much about the South. But do you think this is something as well where African women, or women in general, because if you look at this International Women's Month that we're talking about, it's quite celebrated in the West. But how is it celebrated in Africa? Probably it's only in the cities, in the villages or the towns. Many people don't know about it. So women need to take that initiative to start publicizing, if you can put it that way, or talking about their own history, as you said earlier, or write their own history, so that campaign about it, because we've seen it's like a struggle, you know, and nothing comes for nothing. But the other obstacle that I believe African women, or is affecting African women here, is them being laid back, being like, you know what, all right, if it happens, it happens. If it don't happen, it don't happen. Am I correct there? All right.
Let me come in between you two.
Stereotypical.
Let me come in between you two there, because I think although you are slightly on opposing ends, we need to. I think we necessarily need to go a little further than that.
Okay.
Look, I agree that it doesn't matter that a woman must write their own story or write a story about another woman. But I would think that it doesn't have to be a woman. Men must learn to write about women as well.
Men as partners.
Men must think that their story is not necessarily more important than the woman's story. If a man has a pen and a paper, why should they always write about another man? They should write about themselves, about women as well. And that we begin to achieve a lot more when men's ways of thinking themselves are the ones that say, look, our history is a history of both male and female, and I want to be part of completing that history, rather than saying, look, since I'm a man and I'm not a woman, I'm going to write about a woman. Look, you rightly say.
But do you think the woman will know much about herself than you do?
Let me make the mistakes, but writing about a woman is still just as worth, because it is a record that's out there. But you also rightly put it this way. The publishing house is owned by a man, is run by a man, and a woman must walk in there and try and convince both men that she has a story to tell, and the man have to read the transcript and that sort of thing. So there are structural challenges that you have in a society that's already built in a particular way. And even before you get to that, if a woman had taken the extra step of putting pen to paper, that itself would be a victory, in the sense that if the girl child is growing up thinking that only men write books, the girl child is not even going to get to the stage of thinking about writing a book until those who already have the pen and the paper start writing about women anywhere, so that the girl child sees themselves in a book and want to write a book. It's that inspiration, the inspiration for a more equitable world shouldn't be a burden of women. It should be our burden, all of us together.
Society's burden.
But I thought you were saying the same thing in a slightly different way. You were sort of saying women must go out there and be champions and provide role models. I think fathers and brothers out there should be role models in terms of how they treat a boy and a girl, in terms of how they converse with a boy and a girl. But
I think I absolutely say that, and I think within that you might have heard me say, and we need men as partners.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
And that's very important for me.
I don't want them to be partners. I want them to be equal. Because, look, if you start to say that they're partners, you are giving more of the responsibility to one gender over the other. Okay, yeah. I think that men, just like we should have a mindset that says we want to equalize.
Absolutely.
We want to be fair. Not to equalize. I think equalize is the wrong word, because if you're equalizing...
equity.
Equity. I don't think it's a good thing, because when you say equity, you're starting from a position that says these people are starting from an equal position anyway. We're not starting from an equal position. A man is already here, and a woman is already here. You might need to write... For every one story about a man who successfully write, you need to look for 2 or 3 female stories in order to end up with fairness in terms of representation in the published world.
So as partners, you know the levels that you're talking about, we're aspiring to get there, so we have this even playing field, aren't we? So as partners, you work with us as we get to that So we work together. You support and you champion us as we work towards that.
Yeah.
And so I think partner could take different dimensions. You could take ownership as well. You definitely can take ownership of that. And you should, actually. You should. You wouldn't be where you are today without the women behind you and around you. You are who you are because your women have been part of your history, just like you have been a part of our history.
If you talk about me, look.
No, not you specifically.
I'm
you as
where
men.
I am because of no men. I'm where I am because of my mother, and she's a woman, and my sisters.
Absolutely.
My brothers have all they've done is compete with me in different ways, and I think I would have done with a little bit less of that. But I've had a lot more support.
I'll let you keep that for next time.
Do you know what I've just remembered as well? We had a bit of a discussion pre the show recording. We talked about agriculture and how the largest providers of food in Africa are actually the subsistence farmers. It would be wise as well to point out that actually more than 50% of that production is by women, actually above 60% of the production of food in Africa is by women. So empower them with the tools to go larger as well. You know, those are some of the other arguments around this. There's so many dimensions to this whole.
That, though, I agree with what you just mentioned, but the empowerment that you're talking about, if we can just bring yourself as an example here, you work for the DEWA project, you know, where you had a policy research lead. So looking at that, what were some of the challenges that you faced? Because if you look at, for you to get where you are today, you must have encountered certain challenges, or the kind in terms of jobs or anything, you know, to get there, climbing the ladder. So what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the advice that you can give to other African girls that lives in this country, both home and abroad?
Okay, so thanks for that. That's actually a good question that sort of also addresses the fact that we as black women, to start with, of African heritage, have got this double-edged sword, where the legacy of colonialism, obviously, and then also we have the patriarchy system. You know, they're double-edged swords in all circumstances. When it comes to DEWA Project, so DEWA Project is an organization that I co-founded along with some other colleagues. It's Development and Empowerment for Women's Advancement, and I am the policy lead, as you said, and there have been quite a lot of challenges. So prior to getting to where I am today, I used to work for charities within the UK. I was Regional Women's Development Officer for one of the big organizations that worked with refugees and asylum seekers. So quite a lot of the work that I have done within the UK has been with refugees and asylum seekers. Again, I think I see myself as somebody who knew my job, who knows my job, and I'm a learner. I'm an everyday learner. But I do think that I was quite okay with the work that I did. But I've also seen that within the sector, even if it's a sector that does work with ethnic minorities, predominantly considering I was working with refugees and asylum seekers, there is it structural racism? It's inherent racism that's also within the structures of the sector that says it's working to the benefit of the people. So a lot of refugee and asylum-seeking women would come through the system, they get their refugee status, etc. Then you get to this stage where they'll volunteer quite a lot with these organizations, learn the skills. The minute the big organizations get funding, you will find that the jobs are not allocated to those people who've actually been powering those organizations to go forward. What you find is that a fellow white person from elsewhere will come in and get trained to actually do that work. So those are some of the challenges that I have experienced myself as well in certain aspects, but I think more so for the women that I work with, and it does speak a lot to the limits that society will give you. Yes, one integrated society. Some things are just words. You know, the challenges are challenges based on gender, and these women are women who've worked and given time of theirs, and they're not empowered beyond that, even if they've acquired the mastery and the skills. Then beyond that, within DEWA Project, the organization I work with is an organization now that is led by black ethnic minority women, and we push ourselves, we challenge ourselves, and we fight for the same pots of funding. We do everything that everybody else is doing.
So in terms of that, sorry, Sibanda, you wanted to say something? I'm just looking at, do other women, like the women that you're working with, especially coming from ethnic minorities, do you share the same stories? Is Is it the kind of the same difficulties that you face, or each and everyone come with their own unique story?
Everybody is unique. Everybody is unique. Everybody has got challenges of their own. But in terms of what drives the agenda of the disadvantages that a lot of women face, you will find that we've got the basis of it is very similar. So challenges will vary between people, but the stories are recurring. And that's why you have so many campaigns out there that tend to focus on similar issues when it comes to women's issues.
Sure, you bring together the challenges of racism and gender imbalances in a nice way there when you're talking about, and I'm interested in seeing how if there are ways of sort of understanding how in fact being one gender or another even in the Western society may in fact or interplays with, or whether the agenda to end racism aligns in any way with the agenda to end gender imbalance. I say this because obviously, you know, I have, you walk into, I've looked at different research on different things, and you find some people suggest that different genders are treated differently within an international immigration system, and also when they become settled and so forth. But also, are there any advantages that a girl child gets who's an ethnic minority gets from growing up in this society as compared to what experiences of life would be if they grew up in Africa? Any connections between racism and gender imbalance?
Okay, so you've asked me quite. You've loaded your statement. I'm trying to see what needs answering. So the girl child, the girl child raised here versus the girl child raised in Africa. I think hand on heart, we have to acknowledge the fact that there's transparency in terms of what a woman's rights are here, and just basic human rights. There's that sort of recognition of what they are as you are growing up. It's part and parcel of what you are now. And
the opportunities as well, I believe. That goes for both men and women, growing up here or growing up in Africa, I guess. Because if you look at the opportunities that are available here in this country, sorry for cutting you off there.
That's okay.
And the opportunities that are available in Africa, is incomparable, to my own understanding. Because if you look at education system or in terms of job opportunities, so if you say you can compare the African girl that lives in this country and the African girl that lives in Africa in terms of the gender imbalance or the opportunities or the disadvantages, it's going to be to my own opinion, is not something to compare, because probably in Europe you can compare it looking at this country to another France or Germany, but Africa, do you think is a genuine comparison?
I think obviously we're at polar opposites in terms of where we are in the world of progression. But I think it's also very unfair to trivialize what you get as an education or a foundation in Africa as to something that will not propel you up the ladder. Maybe what we need to start looking at is how best can we turn that education into something that will say we can create our own spaces, our own development. I find that maybe that's what it is. We're always looking for opportunities that are created by others. Why can't we use what we learn to help us create our own opportunities, create those employment opportunities if we need to? Maybe that's and I think that's really personal to me as opposed to me speaking from a feminist perspective. I do find that when I look at myself as an African woman, I'm thinking, what could I have done with my education to turn things around so that I'm also creating opportunities? I shouldn't wait for somebody else to create opportunities for me. And it's quite common here. You will find that a lot of organizations here that push their economy are SMEs. It's not the big organizations, it's people who do startups. Maybe we should start looking more at that. So that education should not just be to pass exams. It should be, what can I do with that?
I think that, for me, the question is whether or not, as an African girl, you would say that because you've necessarily grown up in Europe, you have had better necessarily because of that alone. You've had better opportunities. Look, there are many arguments.
Doc, I lived my formative years both in Zambia and here, so I have had the privilege of living in Zambia, even in a rural setting after my parents died. So I've had a bit of both. So just to clarify on that one, I'm not European raised entirely. I've been raised in Zambia, here, South Africa, and other places.
I'm not. So you know all the ways.
Look, the question I'm trying to struggle, and I don't think that we have sufficient time to deal with here, but I think that the question I think that we should at some point attempt to answer, because I see this in my view, racist undertone in the discussion of the nature and the state of the African woman as the one who's in Africa, as well as the one who's here. Where there is an underlying structure in the language there that says, by the virtue of growing up in Africa, a woman is necessarily more oppressed by men than a woman growing up in Europe. My experience is that women are oppressed everywhere. They're living in a men's society everywhere, not just in Africa, and that the struggle for equality should not necessarily be one that's waged in Africa and not elsewhere, or waged more in Africa and not elsewhere. I think it has to be waged everywhere.
Absolutely.
I believe that those that are making that argument are simply making it in order to suspend or pacify women's struggles in the West, while pushing them to the south.
Interesting you say that. Well, maybe next time I'm here, if you invite me again, we should probably look at the different aspects of feminism and why feminist theory has actually evolved with time, that we now can comfortably say we have a black feminism and African women's feminism, which is, I subscribe to African feminism because it recognizes privilege. It recognizes privilege, and it also recognizes the fact that there are certain things about we as blacks and Africans that are actually not oppression, that have been labeled as oppression. Just like, I think a similar argument that a lot of Muslim women will come and sit down here and say, no, my hijab is not a symbol of oppression. So it is quite a loaded discussion that I think would be very good to have.
I think this is where we should have started thinking about it. But anyway, this is all the time we had for the program. We might have to look at inviting Tchiyiwe in April, May, maybe, to come and look at this question. But from my friend Baillor, Tchiyiwe, and myself, this is African Voices. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.